Controversy at Disney again. We've got more changes coming to the Disney parks relative to Splash Mountain. I'm interested in talking about the stories and why a writer or a storyteller, a producer might want to change their stories over time. We've seen George Lucas do it. We've seen Disney do it. Why are all of these places changing their stories over time? The latest is Splash Mountain with their Princess and the Frog refurb, essentially. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I have a writing program as a writer and a producer of my own content. I have a writing program where I talk about how to write and produce your own stories. So why would these big producers, why would they want to change the stories that their organization has already produced? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm Jay Shear, co-writer and co-producer of Timeslingers, which is a time travel novel available on Amazon. It's a top seller. It was a top seller in time travel and alternate history science fiction, which is really cool. And in my program, I teach you, by the way, how to make your novel, book, movie, whatever, a top seller or a bigger viewed, more often viewed thing on YouTube. It's really for storytelling of any kind, mostly just fiction. And my background is all in science fiction and fantasy. But today we're talking about Princess and the Frog coming to the Splash Mountain attraction, both at Disneyland and Disney World, Walt Disney World. And you're probably thinking, like, what do these rides have to do with writing and producing stories? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. It is because inherently, when we look at these rides, they have stories attached to them. In fact, the moment you enter the land that the rides are in, they're already setting the tone of the story you're about to enter. And then you ride a ride where a story occurs, a story unfolds. And when that story unfolds, you have an experience, just like you would reading a book or just like you would watching a movie. There's a story associated with these things. And so I wanted to take a look at why a big producer, I'm an independent, small press, self-published producer, but why would these big companies want to change their stories over time? If you have opinions, by the way, on Splash Mountain, on the story changes that they're announcing to Splash Mountain, then definitely leave those in the comments and we can have a good conversation about that. In the meantime, I'm just going to jump into it and talk about this. One of the things that is really interesting to me is that I always talk about finding an audience for your stories, right? How do we as writers and producers find people who want to engage in or with our stories? And as I look at what Disney's doing and how Disney shifts and changes over time, I think it's really interesting to look at it both from a writer's perspective, but also to look at it from a producer's perspective. Because a writer and a producer have slightly different ideas about how something should be done. A writer and who is also a producer of their own works may even think differently than just a writer or just a producer. And so as we think about Splash Mountain and we think about Splash Mountain as a story, we're going to talk about the stories that actually that Splash Mountain is derived from. And then we're going to look at exactly like what story might they be changing it to. And again, what we're going to see is that Splash Mountain has an existing story that its writers, its Imagineers worked on, its producer, Disney is the big producer, saying we want to greenlight that story in that ride. And then we have them saying, hey, maybe we want to change it. Maybe we want to actually not go with that story and go to a different story, in this case, Princess and the Frog. So why would they want to do that? What's the whole point behind that? And I will tell you, analyzing how Disney adjusts to the way that it tells a story is very instructive to people who write and produce their own stories. Why is that? Because Disney are some of the most professional storytellers on the planet. And so if we look at how Disney is doing something, it can teach us some things about how we might want to handle our own content. So the first thing I want to bring up is just that we've got this history of Splash Mountain and stories that came before that. So if you were to look at Disney storytelling, you would see that Splash Mountain is based off a movie that they produced back in the 40s, early to mid 40s, called Song of the South. And Song of the South was a film that actually got a lot of positive attention when it came out. But over the course of time, people started realizing that it actually had some very problematic themes in it that that were not probably healthy. Now, I'm telling you this as somebody who has not seen that film in a really long time, if ever. I don't remember that film whatsoever. So we're not going to go deep into that film because I don't remember it and I can't analyze it for you. But the general takeaway from that film is that it was conceptually a kid comes to visit basically a plantation, I guess. And one of the people who's working there at the plantation, called Uncle Remus, tells him stories that help him deal with his changing life and him realizing that there are more problems in the world and how is he going to deal with those problems. And this story is sort of what that's about. But of course, it has some very stereotypical racist portrayals of the Black community in that film. Again, haven't seen it in a really long time, if ever, because I do not remember it. So I can't tell you that that's true. If you've seen it, then you can let me know down in the comments below if that's an accurate thing. But it has to be pretty accurate because Disney loves making money off stuff and refuses to release it. So I have a feeling that they're doing that because they realize that they could face cultural, societal, and financial consequences if they did release it because of how problematic it is. So that's the original story from a Disney standpoint. But before Song of the South, actually, there was a series of stories that came out that Song of the South was based on. So if you're looking at Splash Mountain, you're actually saying, here's Splash Mountain based on Song of the South, which was based off these Uncle Remus stories. And the Uncle Remus stories had Briar Rabbit, Briar Bear, Briar Fox. And the essential thing is Briar Rabbit is always finding himself in a place where he is learning something about life. They're kind of like, I guess you could call them morality tales in some way, shape, or form. So you have those original stories. I don't know because I haven't read those stories in a really long time. I am pretty sure I've read those stories as a kid. But I don't know if some of the same racial stereotypes and racist portrayals exist in those stories too. I don't know if that's just Song of the South as a film or if it goes back to the original books. I don't know. I'm ignorant on this topic. So we're using cartoon characters in a way to tell a morality tale. Sounds a lot like something Walt Disney would have done, right? In fact, probably what he was attempting to do with Song of the South. Just at that time, those portrayals were not seen as offensive as they are today, because people were not aware of the Black experience in America, or if they were aware of it, maybe they didn't care and they were just racist. So that's a thing that exists, right? And then in the early 90s, Splash Mountain comes out, and Splash Mountain is based on the Uncle Remus stories, not exactly Song of the South, because we don't actually see some of the characters that are in Song of the South in the ride. But obviously there are still some story elements there that are shared across not just the movie, but also the stories that came before that. And then fast forward again, before I fast forward, the Splash Mountain storyline is an interesting one. I'm a Disney pass holder, so this is interesting to me. The Splash Mountain story is really different. It basically is Briar Rabbit trying to find his laughing place. You get the impression that his laughing place is the place wherein he's able to escape the problems of the world. As he tries to get to his laughing place, Briar Fox and Briar Bear are trying to, I don't know if they're trying to eat him, or I think they're trying to eat him. They're trying to get him. I'm assuming to eat him. And he's escaping them in these various ways. And he's using his smarts to outwit them and get away from them. And then there's an indication that when he finds his laughing place was actually way back at home where he started. And so therefore the people around him were his laughing place. They were the place where he could escape some of the problems that the world presented to him. So it's sort of, maybe you could call that an example of how we go to community to get away from some of the negative attributes of what we see in life. And so you've got those three stories. You've got the original stories, the original Uncle Remus stories, followed by The Song of the South, followed by Splash Mountain, all a little different, all containing different information in them. And then Disney comes along and says, you know what? Because Splash Mountain is based off Song of the South, because we don't really like Song of the South, we know that because they've taken it so you can't watch it. We are going to retheme Splash Mountain. So obviously there's probably lots of opinions based on that. But again, I'm going back to, I'm a writer and a producer. So what I'm wondering is, why would they be changing this story from a writing and a producing standpoint, right? We're asking the question slightly differently, because most people will ask this question, and most people, in fact, in the comments, you can let me know what you think. But most people will answer this question as, okay, do I like the ride as it exists today? Do I like Princess and the Frog? Which one do I like better? And they'll just give you your preference. Oh, I like this one better. So that's what it is. By the way, if you want to ask me any questions about this as I go through it too, just feel free and drop a question in the comments, and I'll address that too. So that's what we're being set up with. That's the story is changing. I mentioned earlier that we've seen George Lucas change his stories in the past too. Maybe not to this degree, but George Lucas has swapped in and out some of his own storytelling elements because he's going, oh no, I like it this way better, and he changes it. And in the Star Wars community, that has also hit a lot of feedback that is negative. We don't want you to change these things. We don't want you to update these things. So it's an interesting thing as a writer and a producer to look back and go, oh wow, people don't like changing the original stories if they fell in love with them. But at the same time, stories are something that shift and change over time through our collective exchange as human beings. We're constantly exchanging stories with one another. We're constantly revising those stories based on our life experience. And then we're left with a lot of, oh, this story is not necessarily the way I see it anymore. What I wrote, 10 years ago is not my same shared experience today. In fact, when I started writing Time Slingers, my time travel novel, that was way back in 2005 when I started writing that. That was from today's date. That's 15 years ago. And so, of course, I don't write anything about anything that I have drastically different opinions on in this book that I would want to change today. But the fact of the matter is, I have changed my mind about some things that I did believe when I wrote the book. So it's not surprising that in storytelling, both the writers and the producers would have changing views on how a story shows up for their audience. And that's another big component of this. And that's one of the things I talk about in my e-learning course is, how do you find an audience for your stories? And ultimately, you can write for yourself, and that's totally fine. Maybe you don't even want to sell your stories. You can do that. But if you're going to look for an audience at some point in time, you have to draw them in with something that engages them and makes them want to stick around. And so that also creates a shifting landscape for you. For example, I'll go back to the George Lucas example I was using earlier. Not only did George Lucas change his stories over time, but he kind of kept writing for the same audience group. In other words, in 1977, he sort of set out to write movies for 10 to 12-year-olds. Now, that doesn't mean that the movies aren't applicable to people my age, because I love Star Wars. I think Star Wars is amazing. So I'm not saying he did that if you're 40, you can't enjoy Star Wars. Of course you can enjoy Star Wars if you're 40. But what my point is that he was writing it for a very specific type of audience. Fast forward to the prequels. When the prequels came out, I was, what is that, late 90s, early 2000s. So I'm, in my early 20s, but he was including characters like Jar Jar that felt like they were for a 10 to 12-year-old. And so he's doing that. He's sticking to the same audience, but in different decades. And so he's not writing the prequels for me again. He's writing the prequels for a different generation of people, almost trying to draw more people into his world. So stories change over time. And as writers and as producers, sometimes we want to change those. Now, sometimes if you're writing for somebody else, you don't get the option to change it yourself, right? Like, sorry, but you don't get to change it. The producer doesn't want you to change it. And so the writer could be like, I don't even like that story, but the producer just keeps producing it. This has happened several times in the comic book world. We've heard Alan Moore has said, my beliefs have shifted and changed, and I don't even like the comics that I came out with before. I've heard this from other creatives too. I've heard this from the Beastie Boys. The Beastie Boys have said, we don't even like performing some of our old songs. They've adapted the words because they don't like the words that they used originally in those songs. But the production companies who own the rights to those things may still be releasing them. So this is an advantage if you own the rights to your story, that if you want to change them down the road, you can. And so obviously the writers of Song of the South, and most certainly the writers of the Uncle Remus stories, they're not even probably alive anymore. And so now Disney's looking at this as the people who own the rights to it. And they're, as producers, they're putting their producer hats on and going, what's the best thing for us to do from a production standpoint? And then they look at their list of properties and they go, well, which properties do we have that we maybe haven't done enough with yet? And so that's another viewpoint on it that I think that is probably where Disney's coming from. Now, I happen to really like the theming of Splash Mountain as it is today. Again, I haven't seen Song of the South. If I have seen it, I don't remember it. So I can't comment on the negative stereotypes and the racist stereotypes that presents to us. All I can comment on is that Splash Mountain as it exists right now is a fun ride, and it's a lighthearted ride, but it's really well themed. And we engage in it because as we walk through New Orleans Square and we walk past, we start to enter Critter Country in Disneyland. So we walk past, so you're in New Orleans Square, you walk past the Haunted Mansion, and then Splash Mountain comes in, and that's where we find Critter Country. We're entering Critter Country, and there's Splash Mountain. And the environment we're entering from a storytelling perspective, they're creating a setting for us. And the setting is mostly Critter Country, but we just left New Orleans Square. So it's a transition, kind of a transition zone. And then they go into, now granted, from a producer standpoint, what Disney is going to look at this from a producer standpoint is, how much does it cost for us to do this thing? If we do this thing and it costs us a lot of money, refurbs, especially the kind that Disney's talking about, the level of refurb they're talking about is very expensive. Very, very expensive. They're talking about gutting the entire thing and changing all of the audio animatronics, a lot of the theming. Probably not all the theming, but a lot of the theming. The nice thing is they do probably get to keep the existing track, and I'm assuming, and keep the existing structure, which saves them a little bit of money. But overarchingly, they've got to change, in order to change just the story, they've got to really adapt a lot of things in order to do that. So from a producer's perspective, remember, the writers are no longer involved because the people who wrote the story for the ride are probably still around in some capacity. Are they actively working at Imagineering? I have no idea. So they may be around, but the people who wrote Song of the South or the Uncle Remus stories are not around. So they have like no say in the matter whatsoever. This is largely being driven by the producers, not the writers. That's my point. So Disney's thinking, if we do a big refurb to this, how does this benefit us? Also, if we did a big refurb to this, how could it negatively impact us? Because if it's just a cost on their bottom line, thinking from a producer standpoint, if it's just a cost on my bottom line and I don't get any advantages of it, meaning bringing in more revenue, then do I really want to make this change? Now, a lot of times as an audience, we don't look at the changes in that way. And it's the same thing for storytellers when you're reading someone else's work versus when you write your own work. You're thinking about, can I produce a book that is not just going to put me back financially, but can I actually make a little bit of money off of it just so that I can keep writing more books or whatever? And it's not even like you're trying to get rich per se. You're just trying to put out good stories that people love. But at the same time, you don't want to go into financial troubles because you just want to be a writer and that's your go-to thing. And so if you're thinking about it from a producer standpoint, you're still thinking about the economic impact of you writing and producing this story. It's really, really, self-publishing is pretty cheap these days because you can do like ebook publishing. But if you think about it in the context of like doing a short film, we did a short film. We did Star Wars Rivals, which is on this YouTube channel. That costs a lot of money. So if we're going to put all of these resources, it can't be like we're going to go back every 3 years and rechange the story because that's so expensive to do. So if you're looking at this from Disney's perspective and you're looking at it from a producer, we put our producer hats on, they're looking at Splash Mountain and they're going, you know what? Splash Mountain is troubling from a societal perspective because it harkens back to some of these things that we don't even want to show anymore because we feel like they're offensive. Okay. All right. So we don't want to do that because so I don't have a property that I can sell to make additional money off of, right? They can't sell Song of the South. They're not going to make any money off that. They've decided not to sell that. They've decided that the cultural and societal impact of releasing that film is negative, and therefore they're not going to make any money off of that property. So they're looking at this ride at Disneyland and they're going, well, we don't really make any money off this ride, right? Like there's no, people come into the park and sure, like some pass holders probably love the ride. So like it makes sense to have a ride that is cool, but would we be willing to put forth some capital, some money to refurbish this? And could we do it in such a way that would help out our other stories? Now, why would you choose Princess and the Frog? Well, there's a really cool cultural, societal component here. We can take what was based off a film that we find problematic culturally and societally because it portrays the Black community in negative stereotypes, racist stereotypes that we do not want to continue. And we have a property over here that is based off the Black community and how the Black community is really better portrayed in modern America. That being the Princess and the Frog. So now they're looking at Princess and the Frog and they're going, oh, we have pretty awesome societal cultural impact if we take a problematic property and turn it into a really cool property. They have that going for it. But that doesn't necessarily mean it'll make them any more money, right? Because just because you make the change doesn't necessarily mean that it makes you more money. So again, we're keeping our producer hats on and we're taking a look at this. And if you were Disney, one of the things that you would realize, I think, about Princess and the Frog. Now, I don't know what your opinion is on Princess and the Frog. You can let me know what you think of Princess and the Frog in the comments. But it's one of my favorite Disney films. It's one of my favorite animated films of all time. And if I'm Disney and I'm looking at Princess and the Frog, I'm thinking to myself, not enough people saw Princess and the Frog when it came out, but we still believe in it as a film. In fact, we believe it's a really, really, really good film. We've introduced some of those elements at Disneyland, but not a lot of those elements. So now if Disney says, producer hat on, if we change the story of Splash Mountain, from a producing perspective, we'll tell a different story using the existing framework we have. It's still going to be really expensive, but what do we get out of it? So we've already talked about the societal, cultural impact that we get out of it that's positive. But now I can also take a look at it and say, it might sell me more movies because it might get people who have never seen Princess and the Frog before to go, I really like the music on this ride. I really like the theming on this ride. I should go watch Princess and the Frog again. And maybe it's someone like me who already loves Princess and the Frog. They might say something like, you know what, friend of mine, you should go watch Princess and the Frog again. They just did the refurb over at Disneyland. Fantastic ride. I rewatched the movie the other day. It's great. You should go watch that too. And now those people are going to go watch it, tell all of their friends about it, and pretty soon you have a lot of word of mouth going around. Well, then Disney can say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to release another Princess and the Frog film. We're going to do a sequel to Princess and the Frog. And then they could even make more money off of it. So, audience perspective is, hey, cool. A lot of people like Splash Mountain. Most people don't even realize what Splash Mountain is based off of. It's just a fun ride. Well-themed, fun ride. But now Disney is saying Norland Square is right around the corner from Critter Country. Norland Square is right around the corner from Splash Mountain. We can change Splash Mountain, keep the theming going. You've entered the story, you've entered the environment, you move forward, you ride the ride. And guess what? If we have that ride there, right now we can't make any money off Song of the South. We can't make any money off the Splash Mountain theming the way that it is. We're not pursuing any Uncle Remus stories. Not now. But what we could do is retheme that ride and potentially sell more things using Princess Tiana and Princess and the Frog as their theme. And so it basically, from a producing standpoint, almost becomes an advertisement for some of their other stories. And they get to double down on something that they really like, that they feel like some people did not catch up on. So obviously, it's easy to look at that from a writer and producer standpoint and see the differences between the two. Writers oftentimes want to get involved in the story. Creatives want to get involved in the creation of something. But if you look at it from a producer standpoint, you start to see different sides of that coin. So it's one of the things I like to talk about when I talk about writing and producing your own stories, because you oftentimes have to take off your writer hat and put on your producer hat. And sometimes that means, now, granted, I'm not a fan of what is being called fan service these days. I'm not a fan of fan service, which means fan service, if you don't know what it is basically writers or creators specifically making something that they know that the fans will love just because the fans will love it, even if it doesn't make sense to the story itself. It's like, oh, we know if the fans will love it if we put it in there. So that would be called fan service. Now, fan service can be a really good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're ruining the story if you have fan service, but it can also be a bad thing, because it can also say, like, in some cases you could add fan service in a way that doesn't make any sense to the story, but you're just doing it so that your core fans will be really, really excited. So I think that it basically, when you put on your producer hat and you take off your audience hat for a second, so you take off your audience hat, you put it aside, you take off your writer hat, you put it aside, you put on your producer cap, and you can actually see, yeah, retheming this seems like it makes sense. Now, the question that the producer is constantly asking, and the question that Disney's going to have to ask themselves, is how much is this going to cost and how much could we get in return? And I think basically probably what Disney is thinking, because Disney's been thinking about this refurb for a while, and probably what they're thinking is that we're not going to make any money off the Uncle Remus stories or the Song of the South stories for any foreseeable future in our company. But if we were to change Splash Mountain, then we could potentially use it as an advertisement. We could use it as something that's going to bring more people not only into the park because they want to see the new ride, but also, again, like I talked about, more people purchasing Princess and the Frog, perhaps doing a sequel to Princess and the Frog, and making more money that way. So you can see that, before Disney owned Star Wars properties, they partnered with George Lucas to do Star Tours. After Disney owned Star Wars, Galaxy's Edge in both parks, untold numbers of new rides. Why? Because now they can make more money off those things. Before, they were just making money off park admission for people who wanted to go to Star Tours. Now they're going, yeah, but we make money off selling the movies. We make more money off Disney Plus. We make more money off all of the things Star Wars if we have an entire land dedicated to Star Wars. So we're going to do Galaxy's Edge now. And that's, again, them putting on their producer hat. So again, I just go back to this because I think it helps to look at sometimes the way that companies and organizations make decisions, because when you're putting on your producer hat as a writer, then you can say to yourself, why would I be making this decision from a producer standpoint? Because the producer is the one that's probably putting up the money. The producer is probably the one making a lot of the money. Sometimes the writers, obviously the writers get a cut of it. And when you look at it from that perspective, it looks a little bit different. So we have the audience's perspective, which is your perspective. Do you prefer Splash Mountain the way it is, or would you rather see it change to Princess and the Frog? And then you've got the other components to that as well. If you have any questions for me, please leave them in the comments. If you have any comments on whether or not you like Splash Mountain better, or whether or not you like Princess and the Frog better, leave that down for me below too. David Murphy says Disney killed Star Wars. That is a popular opinion. I don't know, David, if you've seen The Mandalorian. Personally speaking, The Mandalorian is my favorite Star Wars thing, even above the original trilogy. So for me, it's like The Mandalorian, and then I go Empire Strikes Back, and then I go Rogue One. Those are my top three. Two of those are Disney. Then it's the other original stuff before we get to some of the other properties, because the originals are what I grew up on. So of course I'm a big fan of the originals. But we have this is the different perspectives. We have audience perspectives, we have writer perspectives, and then we have producer perspectives on top of that. And obviously Disney is in the producer role for this specific thing. So thanks for the comment, David. I'm assuming, David, that your favorite is the original trilogy. So let me know if that's true in the comments down below. I'm assuming you're an original trilogy fan, but you could be prequel trilogy. You never know. In the meantime, do you have any writing questions? Any writing or producing questions that I didn't address when talking about this whole Disney thing? Again, just this quick shout out. I have an e-learning program that I'm building. I already have one lesson out about how to write and produce your own stories. The lesson that I have out right now, the link to it is in the description down below. It's all about how to find an audience, for your works, even your self-published works. David says he'll give me Mando. Darth Kennedy hasn't put her S. Well, I don't know if maybe she's SJW. I don't know. I don't think that Kathleen Kennedy, by the way, I have a theory. Now we're off Splash Mountain. We're now in Star Wars for a second. I don't know if Kathleen Kennedy is the right person to blame. She's clearly the producer, but the vision for the sequel trilogy seems like, to me, it was coming from two different sources, which is what created some of those problems. In fact, I'm going to be talking about that in a few weeks over on my other YouTube channel, the Story Geeks YouTube channel, because I'll be talking about how people oversee storytelling. And so sometimes Jon Favreau had oversight of the entire Mandalorian series and hired different directors in, but it was Jon Favreau's vision, right? Compare that to the MCU. If you look at Kevin Feige overlooking the MCU, it's Kevin Feige's vision. He might hire different directors to come on and tell different stories, but they have to fit into that overall vision. I don't think that Kathleen Kennedy has ever been trying to play that role. And that's one of the problems that the sequel trilogy has had, because Kathleen Kennedy is not overseeing the entire story. She's the producer for sure. But she's been entrusting the story to different people who did not necessarily agree fully on what that sequel trilogy was going to be overall. But again, I'm going to talk about that on a different show. But it is a good way to look at writing and producing as well, because producers a lot of times hire writers, and if writers don't share the producer's vision for what that's going to look like, then a lot of times that can get really, really messy. That's one of the reasons why I don't try to sell my stories. When I go to write and produce a story, I don't try to sell it to a production company. I don't try to sell it to a publisher, because I want creative control. And a lot of times the producers will take over some creative control, but sometimes the producers will be upset with the writers because they gave them creative control and they don't like the way that it came out. But yeah, we have the Mandalorian, and the Mandalorian is fantastic. In fact, we're doing a whole Mandalorian series over on the Story Geeks channel, so definitely subscribe over there if you're into that. In the meantime, no other further questions about writing or producing, so hopefully this video was informative. I just tried to pull something out of the headlines that I thought would be interesting to talk about from a totally different perspective, a writer, producer perspective, and hopefully you enjoyed it. But go ahead and take a look at my course down in the description down below. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of the writing conversations we're having on here. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll come back and answer those questions later. In the meantime, I appreciate you watching this, and I'll see you on the next one.